All right, let's get into soil and agriculture. This is a really long unit, so I may have to do two videos, but we'll see if I can just get through it. All right, so the objectives are going to be to compare and contrast various agricultural practices around the world and to evaluate various methods used in agriculture to minimize soil depletion and erosion. So let's start off with what is agriculture? Agriculture is food production through farming and forestry. So we've talked about this a little bit in our previous subunits. So we've got certain techniques that we use for agriculture. We've got irrigation, land expansion, herding, crop cultivation, selective breeding, and genetic engineering. So selective breeding and genetic engineering, I'm going to talk about here real quick, just so you know kind of the distinction between two. Selective breeding happens over a course of time, and we've been doing it for a very long time as humans. So it's the breeding for desired traits. So good examples are going to be horses and dogs especially. So when you think selective breeding, think dogs. Like we have bred for certain qualities. Also, corn is a really good one. Genetic engineering, on the other hand, is taking beneficial genes from one organism and implanting them into the DNA of another organism. This is totally safe. People freak out about it, but the DNA is the DNA. It's all we're doing is changing the DNA. It's not like that DNA is going to get into you and like kill you or anything. It's completely safe. So here's just a really good picture of a pug. We have selectively bred to make these stupid little guys. They're pretty cute, but they have a lot of respiratory problems. So it's actually not all that ethical to be breeding for pugs because they kind of live in like a suffering state because they can't breathe very well. They have a lot of respiratory problems and die from that a lot of the times. I know they're cute, but that's just something to think about. And then here's a good example of a genetically modified crop. So we've got white rice over here, and we've got golden rice over here. And we'll talk about golden rice a little later. So we've got different agricultural practices, and they stem from many different factors. So environmental and cultural factors. So like, you know, someone in a tundra is going to be farming differently than someone in a tropical rainforest. Same thing with cultural, like in India, they don't eat a lot of cows. Most people in India don't eat cows. There are certain religions that disallow that. So they're not going to be herding cows there. Rather than in America, where we just like, we love cows, we love eating them. I guess we don't love them, but we love to eat them. So that's a cultural difference. There's socioeconomic differences. So like a plow versus a tractor. So in like more wealthy areas, you're going to have tractors. In less wealthy areas, you're going to have plows with like mules pulling them. Scientific research and improved knowledge, that's a big one. So that's going to be like pesticides, fertilizers, genetically modified crops, etc., selective breeding, that type of thing. Let's get into American agriculture because it's very unique. It's extensive agricultural practices. You know, when you think about the heartland, that's like 6 states right in the middle of America. They have very high productivity, and there's a large cultivation area per inhabitant, which means there's a whole lot of farmland per people in the heartland. And then there's large agricultural area per farmer. So we have been blessed with living in an area where we have a lot of modern technologies, a lot of wealth. So we are able to have like tractors do a lot of the work. So there's going to be more farmland per farmer in America than there is in like Asia, that type of thing. And we export food throughout the world. We're very high-end technologically, and our management practices are very high-end too. We learned after the Dust Bowl. So here's just a good example of American farming techniques. You know, we've got our combine here, and it's pouring it into a tractor, pulling a big old grain bin back there. So we can very quickly and effectively get through large plots of land with only 2 people. And honestly, this may be computer, like there's a computer that's making this tractor go. There might not even be a human in here. We're getting like that technologically advanced to where sometimes you don't even need a human to be running the machine. You can just sit back there and make sure it's going on the right path. So let's get into rangeland and grazing. This is an agricultural technique that a lot of the world uses. It's called pastoralism or pastoral farming. And essentially, it's just raising livestock, moving these herds of livestock like nomadically, and it uses large areas with very low yield. So it's kind of opposite of what we do. We have like smaller areas with higher yield. They have large areas with lower yield. It's diverse. They do a lot of rangeland grazing in all sorts of ecosystems: the desert, the tundra, the mountains, prairie lands, all sorts of places. They're organized by seasonal movements of herds. So they go to one patch of land, they eat up the grass there, they go to another patch of land in the next season to let the previous patch grow back. It's relatively sustainable if you can make it so that not too many people are overgrazing. We talked about that. And this type of agriculture is big in Asia, Europe, and Africa. We still do have rangelands in America, but we're kind of moving away from that practice. Another agricultural practice is rice cultivation. So we've got irrigation farming. That's what rice cultivation is. It's irrigation farming. Essentially, the rice fields are flooded. They set their seedlings down in there. They flood the land. And then this flooding gets rid of weeds and pests. Pests and weeds can't live in this area where rice is really accustomed to living. It's too much water inundation. They just can't survive. They get flooded. This is widespread throughout Southeast Asia. This is like a huge agricultural practice there. And we talked about the California Wetlands Restoration Project with rice. And rice cultivation is like a really highly organized community. It needs a lot of rainfall and it's very labor intensive. So it's highly organized because they kind of use cyclical precipitation to flood their fields, and then they use irrigation as well. So they have to be working with people all around the area because you can't just take all of the water from a stream. You can't divert one stream just to flood your land. You have to work with other people to do that. So we've got tropical plantations as well. And these are just in humid, tropical, heavily forested regions like South America and the Caribbean. We talked about how Brazil has a really bad deforestation problem, and that's because of these tropical plantations without remediation efforts. So they provide a lot of money and jobs for locals, and most of these crops are exported. So there's like a large need for all of these plants: coffee, tea, cacao, coconut, rubber, palm oil. We use these in everyday life. So, you know, if we want to keep using these, we have to keep letting them kind of destroy the land to make these types of plantations. There are remediation efforts. There is like reforestation, and they're able to do these sustainably, but on such a large scale, especially Brazil at this point in time, has kind of shirked the responsibility of creating a great environment for the world. So they kind of just use these things to keep their economy going, but they don't really worry too much about the deforestation impact. So we see this a lot in like Madagascar, Indonesia. A lot of land for those native animals is being destroyed, and we're seeing a lot of extinction events of really cool animals like, you know, orangutans, lemurs, all sorts of really sweet animals are just getting their habitat destroyed because of this industry. So it's pretty bad for the environment when it's not regulated, and it's a huge contributor to deforestation. Let's get into Dutch agriculture because it's pretty neat. They're very technologically advanced. They focus on greenhouse farming. Essentially, they just have lots of very large greenhouses in there because the Dutch environment is very cold and not super fertile. So they do all of their agriculture inside of greenhouses. They export a lot of crops to the world too. Like this small nation exports a lot of crops due to this advanced farming practice. It's the most artificial form of known agriculture practice. They use technology to control the climate and the nature inside of these greenhouses. So they can just kind of make like the perfect environment for whatever they're trying to grow. It's got very high productivity because of this environment with fruits and veggies, and they have really high contributions to the global food supply. And they produce about 50% of the global flowers and plants. So the next time you get some roses for your loved one, they may have come from the Netherlands or any Dutch region. So that's something fun to think about. Here's just a really good picture of a huge greenhouse and like how they cultivate all their plants. Another thing that is just kind of interesting to talk about is the Victory Gardens. So Victory Gardens were proposed in World War I and World War II because there was a shortage of crops because most farmers were off fighting. Most of the male population was gone. They were across the seas, you know, killing, getting killed, all sorts of stuff. They're fighting for their country. So civilians, mainly women, were pressured to make their own gardens to supply fruit and veggies to themselves and the local communities. And we called these Victory Gardens. And this is just a really good example of like World War I, World War II era propaganda. So it's not just North Korea that does propaganda. Every single nation on the world does propaganda. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just like more of like a nationalist type of thing. So here's just a cool little picture of propaganda here. Uncle Sam says garden to, I can't see what this is, but something crisis or crops or whatever. But they're saying, you know, if you don't make a victory garden, then you're going to be un-American. So really what it was they're just really low on food, so they were trying to make the people be more self-sufficient so that a lot of people wouldn't die. It was a good thing. I know it kind of sounds negative with the propaganda thing, but it was a good thing. All right, I'm going to stop here, and then we'll have another video on soil conservation and the rest of this unit.